Good afternoon, everyone. Really appreciate everyone taking the time to be here. We set out this day and time for some special programming to have our wonderful consultants at Mehlman take us through a post-election briefing. 6 weeks in the rear view, I think we are all pretty clear on the outcomes, but certainly want to drill down into the data and best understand what it means for our companies and this industry and opportunities going into the new Congress. And so without further ado, let's turn it over to Sage. And Sage, welcome, good afternoon, and take it away.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Always good to be with the ECFC crew. It's a rather pleasant day here in DC. We're actually getting some almost spring-like weather. So hopefully wherever you all are, you're getting some good weather as well today. As Sarah mentioned, obviously we're 6 weeks in the rear view of the election. We know what happened. I do want to touch a little bit at the start, just a little bit on sort of why it happened, because it helps us understand the majorities that are now in Washington, D.C., and it's not just about the majorities. Yes, we do have a democracy where majority rules, but obviously the minority plays a big role here in Washington, D.C., and something we'll need to keep on our minds. And then walk through a little bit of what we expect out of the new administration, just some recommendations for us as we plan to go into 2025 and beyond. So, I'd first start out with a little bit of play. It's not MAGA elections, it's MACA elections, right? Where we're mandating again change in America. And as you guys have seen us do this before, right? We love to throw up this slide and look at all the change elections. You look at the 60s and 70s, about 3 change elections where one party was beating the other party, either at the House, the Senate, or the White House level. 80s and 90s, you get about 4. And you look at the 2000s, right? In virtually every single election, except for 2004 and 2012, were change elections. So voters are constantly mandating change out of Washington. And you think, like, why is that? And you look at this slide and you sort of look and say, like, well, clearly people aren't happy. And you can go back and look at about 2003, you see the right track, wrong track number diverge, where wrong track is now the plurality, if not the outright majority of voters. But if you go back even a little bit before, and it's really back in 2001, where you see that 55-29 number. And ever since 2001, we've been going in the wrong track. Right, we've been going in the wrong direction. That is, the number of people thinking it's going in the right direction was either falling or staying significantly below the number of people thinking we're heading the wrong track. And in fact, this divide has gotten to the actual worst gap in the country's history, or at least as long as the polling data that we've been able to find goes back. So huge gap in terms of the right track, wrong track. So again, starting to understand why Americans keep throwing sort of a hand grenade into the elections and blowing things up and saying, Washington, please give me something more. And additionally, I say, if we look at this, we see voters are angry, right? There's the economic insecurity, record income inequality, driving angst among some many working families, food inflation in general, the cost to fill your car, the cost to fill your grocery cart, all of these things hitting Americans really where it hurts. Also, I would say just globally, right? We saw a massive run up in the 90s and 2000s towards globalization. It was going to lead to cheaper goods, more stable supply chains. And we saw this drawback, right? And trying to reshore it, refill factories here in America. You also saw, obviously, most poignantly right now, first land wars in Europe in over half a century. So you have Russia launching attacks in Ukraine, you have what's going on in Gaza. So globally, you see this type of unrest. Here again in America, you're seeing the social unrest, whether it's the rising up post George Floyd, whether it's a woke backlash or a stay woke propaganda or efforts in the last 10 years or so. But a lot of social unrest and social activism leading people into the streets. And then obviously, our politics has not been very calm, and people storming the Capitol there post January 6th. Obviously, the attempted shooting of then candidate Trump, leading to sitting President Biden to drop out. So just a lot of angst and anger amongst the electorate. All at the same time, our trust in institutions, right? Those places we used to go back to sort of center ourselves was also eroding. So you go back and look at the mid and late 70s, and really only the military has increased. The one that only beats the military, and I don't have on the slide, are small businesses, but church has dropped, public schools, organized labor, the Supreme Court, big business, Congress, down there at 8%. I'd like to find that 8%. As I've said before, those are people you might want to cross the street for if they think they've got a lot of faith in Congress to do the right thing here. I'm not even so sure most of the people in my business who get paid to do this on a daily basis have that level of faith. But kidding aside, this has really shook the fabric of the country when we sort of start to see these shifts, not only all of this angst globally, economically, but also sort of the failure of those comfort factors, those steadying factors in our society. So let's turn a little bit more towards, getting out of the sort of 30,000 foot level and actually start to look at what happened in the campaign, because the candidates did matter, right? And if we look at it, President Biden, clearly unpopular, voters were unhappy with the direction of the country at the time. Excuse me, disapproval rating had shot up to about almost 60%. Some of those economic woes were very much felt, the inflation, crime, what was going on in the border, which really left, Vice President Harris with an extremely short campaign to go out there and define herself, with only 107 days there to get through the end of the election. And really, what did she do in that campaign? I mean, she failed to differentiate herself. I mean, who knew Joy Behar was going to have the toughest question of all of media in this election, which was basically, what would you have done differently? And the vice president said, "There's not a thing that comes to mind." So just really sort of failed to separate the track. And again, we've got the quote up here from Hamilton, the play, which was "Talk less, smile more, don't let them know what you're against or what you're for," which seemed to drive much of the Harris campaign. But it wasn't just that, she had a couple of big major stumbles or failed to differentiate herself. Let's give President Trump some credit as well, in that he was leading on the economy. And we went back to 1952 and said, okay, what was the number one issue in every election, and who was leading on that issue? And what we found was, whatever that issue was, and whoever was leading on it won. I mean, it's really kind of that simple. As James Carville once said, it's the economy. Is the economy stupid? And so we again had economy and immigration. Trump was leading that by +5. And you can go down through history here and again see the number one issue matters more than anything else. We actually dove a little deeper into this, and really, if you look at the top 5 issues that voters said were their priorities in this campaign, President Trump led on everything really but abortion. And obviously that drove a number of voters, but not nearly the gender divide that people had expected it to go down. The other thing I'd give President Trump credit for is the personality piece, which seems a little striking at front. But when you think about the question of, who's got the ability to lead, the strength, the character to do it, and Donald Trump led significantly on this issue by 31 points, actually. So at the end of the day, it was not all that surprising to see Donald Trump win this election, despite the polling saying it was going to be as close as it, but it didn't quite turn out that way. I'd say the last piece, again, and I alluded to this earlier, right, in terms of the abortion issue not driving the gender gap the way people thought it would. President Trump truly did expand in virtually every demographic. If you slice this amongst women, he did 4 points better. Young women, he did 14 points better. Young men, 28 points better. I think the interesting parts are, non-white, Latinos, and African-American men, somewhere between 13 and 25 points better. And also just continuing his real strength in terms of working class families, +6 there. The only group in which really I think Vice President Harris improved upon President Biden's performance was in college-educated women. But virtually every other group, President Trump was able to appeal more broadly. So we've got Republicans control, but we also have control in air quotes, right? Because we have very definitively some of the most small margins in history right now, and the size and safety of those GOP majorities. By safety, I mean how likely are they to maintain those majorities? I think are going to have pretty big impacts on the policymaking and our strategy as we look at how to dive into 2025. And so, just a quick reminder here of where we sit in terms of the House. We like to say the House is the new Senate because the Senate is usually so closely divided and very little margin of error. In fact, the House literally has a a one vote margin of error. They get or a 0 vote margin of error, a 2-seat majority once a couple of members either finish resigning or moving on to their cabinet level posts. And so you'll see for most of January and probably the early parts of next year, Republicans will have a 217 to 215 vote margin in the House, meaning they can't even lose a single vote if they expect to win. And simple things like attendance will matter as to who controls the House next year, and obviously that'll be closely watched. So I don't expect any revolts or changes of parties throughout the year, but it does matter in terms of what votes will be held on the floor. So in astronomically small margin. In fact, we went back, it's been over 100 years since a Congress has had single-digit vote margins, let alone the last 3 Congresses as we've had here. So just a truly divided time in the House. And if you think about it, what's the future hold for the House? The president who sits in the White House almost always loses House seats in that first midterm. So if you go back to 1946, you can see all but 2 elections, the incumbent party lost seats in the House, and usually by some pretty significant margins. Of course, 2002 was George W. Bush's first term, right after the 9/11 attacks. You saw Republicans pick up 8 seats there. And Clinton picked up 5 seats after the Balanced Budget Act and the compromises there in the second term. But clearly, if this trend holds true, even the smallest incumbent loss of 4 seats back in 1962 would switch the House back to Democratic control in 2 years. So a very small and insecure House majority at this point, but maybe Trump and the Republicans will be able to pull off what Clinton and Bush did in '98 and 2002. We'll have to wait and see. Over on the Senate side, computer froze here for a minute. Just a second. There we go. You guys should see this. The Senate's a little safer right now. You have a little bit bigger margin, and it's funny to say that 53-47 is a bigger margin, but that's significantly bigger. Again, the Senate can lose 3 votes and still carry the day with Vice President Vance casting a tie vote at 50-50, whereas the House can lose 0 votes at the moment in order to maintain its majority. I would say additionally, the map for 2026 looks a little better for Republicans. Obviously, Maine, with Senator Susan Collins being up for reelection, there will be a tough reelect, though that's something she has faced throughout her career. So I think if she does choose to run again, and I don't have any reason to think she wouldn't, she should be able to hold that. North Carolina, Ohio, and Texas, though, obviously some pretty solid Republican states there. And then you look at Georgia and Michigan, where Trump carried both of those states by small margins, so Dems have to defend those races. So it doesn't look like, if you play this out on any normal trajectory, and again, we're not necessarily in a normal trajectory time period here, but one can, I think, with some reasonableness, expect the Republicans to maintain control of the Senate, but it would be, again, a very narrow margin, and they might even be, down a seat or 2. Possibility of being up a seat or 2 there, which would give them a fairly substantial majority, at least in terms of this. So, thinking about the Trump administration? And is it, Trump 1.0 all over again? And I would say, apologize for the cough and the water, folks, but just still getting over a little weekend cold. Year five is not year one, right? Trump 2.0 will be different than Trump 1.0. I think there's a couple of really important things for us to keep in mind as we approach the Trump administration. Um, you know, attitudinally, the president is much more confident. He has sat in the Oval Office for 4 years. He's not new to Washington, D.C., or how to deal with uh, members of Congress or the power levers available to him in terms of running the federal government. I would say also that President Trump realizes he's coming in and has 4 years and possibly only 2 years with a Republican majority to get his agenda through. And so while, in the first term, he might have deferred to House Republicans on what to do first or second in terms of taxes and health care. This time around, there's a sense of urgency from Trump, from the president-elect, and from his team that they are going to run hardcore on their pieces and they are going to run as fast as they can. So you just have a more confident, a more knowledgeable, and a more aggressive attitude coming in at the start of the second term. Politically, I'd also say, 8 years ago was really sort of the first time Donald Trump had run and won in Republican circles, right? So we didn't have this Trump primary challenge for people who were breaking with the president. Now, every member of the House and Senate has had to face re-election in the Trump era. So there was just more dominance over the party in the second term. I would say this time around, Democrats, for a number of reasons, in part because of some changes in leadership, in part because of the lack of resistance out there in civil society, are much more in disarray. So the opposition is not nearly as unified as it was 8 years ago. In the last bit there, we would notice that just so the Make America Great Again ecosystem has matured, right? These are people who have coalesced now for the past 8 years and are looking forward to the next four. They've learned from the mistakes they made in the first Trump term. They've learned from the successes they were able to achieve and how to duplicate those. So you just have a much more mature operation all around in the Trump orbit. Globally, I'd also just think there's some key differences, right? U.S. relatively stronger than we were in 2017. We've got a lot of new world leaders, whereas Trump is returning to the stage here. And again, you have sort of this chaos in the global stage with both the war in Gaza and the war in Ukraine ongoing, still tying up good pieces of Europe. So just a fundamental difference in a lot of ways. Now, obviously, what's not changed is Donald Trump himself. In sort of the MAGA vision, the America First vision that he brought to Washington 8 years ago, his sort of chaotic decision-making process. Often the person last in the room is the most influential person in the room. And also, I would say, not always what we consider the most ideological person, right, bending to either a Democrat liberal or a conservative agenda, but very transactional in terms of the things he wants to accomplish. What is the art of the deal that he can make in terms to get his priorities through? So some pretty key differences, but also some pretty key similarities as we think about Trump 2.0 versus Trump 1.0. I think the other people we look at is, and we often say this here in Washington, policy is people and people are policy. And so as we look through the cabinet positions and some of the top positions, we look and think about, where are they repeating what worked, right? The national economic team, trade team, foreign policy team, White House operations, to some extent, though the last one's a little bit fuzzier. But the economic team, right, turning to folks like Secretary nominee Scott Bessent, and Kevin Hassett, a longtime economist and staple here in Washington, D.C., very much look like what uh, President Trump did the first time around in terms of turning to Steve Mnuchin for the Treasury Secretary, and then, of course, Larry Kudlow, who'd been advising Democratic presidents or Republican presidents dating back to the Reagan White House. So very traditional economist mindsets there. Obviously, if we switch to the other side, areas where he was less happy in terms of relying on sort of the staples within Washington, D.C., you've got there his first um, HHS secretary and former congressional member from Georgia, Tom Price, obviously Dr. Fauci there. Compare that to Dr. Oz and RFK Jr. In healthcare, and so you can see sort of the disruptions that are coming in areas where he didn't feel he was able to achieve his agenda. I'd also look through, the deficits and efficiency space, where you see obviously Vivek and Elon Musk down there in terms of running the Doge, this governmental entity, quasi-governmental entity on government efficiency and seeking $2 trillion in cuts and being more aggressive there. So again, repeat what worked, disrupt what didn't. I think as we also think about, the president, again, we talked about this a little bit, more aggressive, more confident. So in like a lion, biggest first year initiatives, we expect a lot of in the international space, both in terms of trade and immigration and deportation. I think the other pieces will be on the tax side. Obviously, as we all know here, large portions of President Trump's 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act are set to expire next year, at the end of next year. So tax reconciliation, this is obviously very critical for ECFC, given that a lot of the products we work with and sell and service are all in that tax-defined benefit space. And so this will be an opportunity, could be a risk for us too, as Washington looks and deals with that budget cutting, whether that's through executive order or balanced budget amendments or through the Doge. We know there's a lot of expenditures in the tax code, a lot of preferences in the tax code. And do they look to curtail any of those pieces? You'll remember in 2017, there was some playing with what we consider the Rothification of accounts, right? Bringing those back on budget in the short term and pushing off the benefits, the tax benefits to the later years in order to sort of play a timing game with the budget and debt and deficits. So all of this is going to be, very front and center. I think also, we just think about the what the president will look to do from more of an executive action standpoint. Obviously, a lot of rollback of Biden executive orders, undoing DE&I, also the push for deregulation and climate. What does this mean? Not as big for ECFC also, but I think one space we'll have to kind of keep an eye on and tangential to some of our pieces are what continues to develop in that crypto, open source AI, and tech-driven platform, and how decisions are being made and how the algorithms are being used to influence products, especially in the healthcare space, will be a key watch. So that's what we're expecting from the Trump administration. Turning to Congress, also very full plate, right? A lot of must-do items. You've got to confirm the cabinet. You've got the Congressional Review Act, which lets Congress go overturn things that the Biden administration tried to do on the way out the door. They'll have to raise the debt ceiling next year, or risk sending the financial markets into total chaos. Action on AI. The House just released its AI task force this morning. Obviously, energy. The big one in the center, again, I already touched on, is the tax reform piece there. You've obviously got immigration, the farm bill that expires, USMCA, the Mexico-Canada U.S. trade agreement that is set for review, the National Defense Authorization Act. So just a huge agenda as we think about what Congress must do next year and what Trump wants to do next year. And I would just sort of look at this and say it feels like we're heading to an everything all at once kind of year, right? If you think back in 2009 and 2010, We had a newly elected Barack Obama as president, and healthcare dominated that, right? The creation of the Affordable Care Act really dominated that entire session. We, we sort of turned the clock. Republicans win back control of the House. And deficit and spending dominated the 2011 and even 2012 a little bit. You had things like the super committee that it was so called, the Joint Select Committee on Deficit Reduction, looking at ways across the federal government to much the way the Doge is trying to do right now in terms of how can we do budgetary savings. 2013 turned to immigration and border, as then Republican Speaker John Boehner tried to cut a deal with Barack Obama at the end of his term, deal with that. Turned to 17 and 18, right after the failure on healthcare tax reform really dominated that year. And then obviously in 18 and 19, as President Trump turned to tariffs, it was the trade wars. 21 and 22 with resurgence of the Democrats and what they considered their Build Back Better, and then later on the Inflation Reduction Act, where you had industrial policy, the CHIPS Act, spending in terms of tax credits in the clean energy space, and even some healthcare matters, all dominated that. The industrial policy really front and center there. And this year we're going to have all of it. So let's get our rest over the holidays, because when Sarah and I return in January and start going back up to the Hill, we're going to have all of these issues coming at us. And so I think just to close here, and happy to take questions, so feel free to start populating the comment section, or be prepared to raise your hand, and we'll try and get to as many questions as we want. Just a couple of recommendations we have for managing all of this chaos and noise, and how do we cut through and stay focused and achieve pieces. And I think it's a couple of recommendations I think ECFC has always done really well, right? And the first is to be bipartisan. We'll need friends on both sides, in part because our issues matter, but also in part because we need to be able to survive over the long haul. We need policies that are lasting. And as you can see from this chart, right, the White House flips from blue to red and back to blue and then to red again. And the Senate flips from blue and then is red for a little while and then is blue for a little while and then back to red. The House, same thing. And we're always expecting that change election, going back to that first slide with all those sort of yellow squares denoting change elections. And, at this point, you used to have a decade or more that you were in control of either the House or the Senate. And that was true throughout the entire 20th century. And now you're barely able to hold on to a House or the Senate for only 4 or 5 years. And sometimes that might mean total alignment, and sometimes it might mean divided government. And so you just kind of never know really what you're going to get. And so I think we have to continue to be focused. At the firm, we like to say we are a bipartisan firm. That does not mean we're a nonpartisan firm, right? I still continue to wear very much my Republican stripes. My colleagues, who you often see join me on these calls, wear their Democratic stripes. And so we constantly go back and forth and try and figure out what's the long-term interest for the clients, just as we need to figure out what the long-term interest for ECFC are. So I think staying bipartisan will be key to us. I think also we've got to know, and this is like a little bit like showing up to spring training every year, right? You got a little batting practice. It's like showing up to, the start of the football season. You're going to run a lot of those basic blocking and tackling drills. For us, in terms of government relations, it's reintroducing ourselves, right? There are thousands of new policymakers that we need to go build new champions with, introduce our issues. 12 new members of the Senate. That doesn't look like a lot, but remember, it's more than 10% of the Senate. There's 66 new House members this year. There are 6 new committee chairs in the House and Senate. Luckily for us, we've had a lot of stability at the Senate Finance and House Ways and Means Committee, which are most important to us. A little bit more turnover in terms of the ranking members. Those are the members of the minority who are the top Republican or Democrat on their committee. And so there's just going to be a lot of new. And again, we go back to Dr. Oz and Mr. Besant and RFK Jr. And there's going to be a lot of new people in the health, tax, and benefit space here. And we're going to need to get in there and know their teams and who ultimately they bring on. So never be too prideful to do a little batting practice or a little blocking and tackling. And for us, again, that's making sure we go up there and do our due diligence in terms of introducing ourselves. I think the last piece I would just sort of talk about, and for as much as we're operating as a trade association here and representing the industry broadly, we have to tell our experience in a very firsthand way. And something we have noticed that, especially in today's America, right? Congress isn't trusted, but people tend to still like their representative. I don't really like big business, but I like my employer. I'm not real sure I trust the mass media, the mainstream media, but I really, am a devoted follower of this podcast, right? The national economy stinks, but I'm doing okay. And I would usually joke if Caitlin was with me today that, I'm not a huge fan of the Democrats, but I sure do love Caitlin. Right. And so the people and the way you experience things. And so I think as we continue to tell our stories, not only as ECFC, but more importantly, as members of ECFC, we've got to really localize our messaging and our talking and make sure we're delivering a firsthand experience to people. So with that, that's our overview. Our founding partner and my dear colleague, Bruce Mehlman, is the genius behind a lot of this. I threw up his free Substack. He does a great 6-slide Sunday morning. So if your coffee in your morning before church isn't getting you going, feel free to tune in and subscribe, and Bruce will get you thinking on Sunday mornings. And then obviously we do some of these bigger decks throughout the year. So appreciate you all, and happy to take some Q&A here, and I'll stop sharing, which hopefully has worked. And happy to take questions about this or anything else as we think ahead to 2025.
Outstanding. Thank you so much.